Welcome to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety, where we talk about the real issues out on the road, focus on safe driving, and learn industry best practices from your hosts Kenny Ray, Mike Bohan, and Jim Seibert, in the hopes that by driving the line, we get more drivers home safe and sound. This podcast was made possible by Marsh McLennan Agency.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Driving the Line, the podcast that is always in the pursuit of safety. This is Mike Bohan, along with my friends and my co-host, Kenny Ray and Jim Seibert. And we are certainly glad you had time to join us today. Jim, Kenny, good to see you both. How's the world treating you guys?
Man, everything's good in Texas. How y'all doing in Missouri?
Well, it's going real well. I have no complaints. I was able to sit up and take nourishment this morning, so things are going real well.
That always beats the alternative.
Yeah, that's right.
Oklahoma is sunny and warm. It's better than pushing up daisies.
That's right. Well, as I said, good to see you guys. For today's episode on our podcast, we're going to jump into the federal motor carrier safety regulations just a bit as we focus on untangling some of the confusion that comes along with pre-trips, with post-trips, and with driver vehicle inspection reports. And I'll tell you guys, I've spent a lot of time over the years visiting with trucking companies and with drivers about this specific topic. And there's definitely been some common questions that have popped up. And they're things like, well, what if I don't drive a truck, tractor, semi-trailer? What if I'm driving a straight truck? Or what if I'm a hot shot driver and I've got a pickup truck and a gooseneck trailer? Am I still required to do all these inspections and fill out all these forms? Or is there a form I got to fill out for the pre-trip? We know we got to do this pre-trip inspection. Do I have to fill out a form for that? I get that question all. Another question that's fairly common is, when are these reports required to be signed? Do I have to sign these at the beginning of the day when I'm doing my pre-trip, or do I sign them at the end of the day? I know there's some requirement there, but we don't know what it is. And I also work with a lot of companies that do drop and hook. And a common question is, do we have to inspect each trailer that we pull every day and prepare a report for it? And I get a lot of the same type of questions for companies that are pulling intermodal chassis as well. And then one other category that I would say a question comes up in is, in our world, we see a lot of leased equipment. And companies will ask, well, if we lease all of our equipment, what are the requirements for that as far as the inspections and the reports, things like that? So let's just begin today to answer some of these questions. And again, what I just covered is kind of the tip of the iceberg. That's just some of the common stuff that we hear a lot of times. But there is a lot of confusion around this topic. And there's a lot of information that we're going to share with you today. So let's just begin to look at some of those regulatory requirements, how they apply to motor carriers, how they apply to the commercial motor vehicle drivers. Jim, I know you've got some of these regulations already queued up, so why don't you just start walking us through kind of the basics for the inspection process?
Sure thing, Mike. Let's just get into the meat and potatoes of it here. To the folks listening, I've got this list in front of me, so let's dissect it. So the 49 CFR 396.13, that's the driver inspection. Before driving a motor vehicle, the driver shall be satisfied that the vehicle is in a safe operating condition. And the word satisfied can mean different things to different people, so I'm glad that it's covered later by the FMCSA. Then we want to review the last driver vehicle inspection report if required. Sign the report to acknowledge that the driver has reviewed it and that there is a certification that the required repairs have been performed. That's under driver inspection. The 392.7 equipment inspection and use says, hey, no commercial motor vehicle should be driven unless the driver is satisfied that the following parts and accessories are in good working order, nor shall the driver fail to use or make use of these parts and accessories if they're needed. Those items: service brakes or trailer brake connections, the parking or the handbrake, steering mechanism, lighting devices, reflectors, tires, horns, windshield wipers, rear view, vision mirrors, coupling devices, wheels and rims, and emergency equipment, under which the emergency equipment, drivers preparing to transport intermodal equipment must make an inspection of and must be satisfied that the following components are in good working order before the equipment is operated over the roadway. That emergency equipment, service brake components, trailer brake connections, lighting devices, lamps, markers, wheels, rims, the lugs and the tires, airline connection hoses and couplers, the kingpin upper coupling device, rails or support frames, tie-down bolsters, locking pins, clevises, clamps, or hooks, sliders, or the sliding frame lock. The 392.8 Emergency Equipment Inspection and Use states that no commercial motor carrier vehicle shall be driven unless the driver is satisfied that the emergency equipment is in place and ready for use. The driver should use the equipment as needed. The 393.95 Emergency Equipment on all the power units. Each truck, tractor, and bus must be equipped with fire extinguishers. Those fire extinguishers, they got to be of the right type for the product that's being hauled. They need to be properly labeled and marked. They need to have a visual indicator showing the status of the charge. And they must be mounted in such a way to prevent rolling or sliding. The extinguishing agents also need to be such that they don't require protection from freezing. Also, spare fuses of each type and size. Some power units where fuses are needed to operate are required parts and accessories. Your truck must also have a warning device for stopped vehicles, such as the 3 bidirectional emergency reflective triangles, or at least 6 fusees or liquid burning flares. Other warning devices can be used in addition, but you can't use them in lieu of one of those 3 that I just stated. So liquid burning flares, fusees, oil lanterns, or any signal produced by flame shall not be carried on any commercial vehicle transporting explosives, flammable gases, or the class 3 flammable liquids. Each fusee shall be capable of burning for at least 30 minutes, and each liquid burning flare shall contain enough fuel to burn continuously for at least 60 minutes. Red flags can't be less than 12 inches square.
Whew. A lot of stuff there, Jim. Thanks for going through that. I know there's a ton of information in these regulations we're covering. That's obvious. But we feel like it's important that we go through this because we want you to have the information. And I think one big thing, if we can summarize the things that Jim just went through, is that driver's got a lot of responsibility, and they've got to make sure that they are satisfied that their vehicle's in safe operating condition, right? And that's one of the regulations that Jim read. But overall, the driver is responsible for making sure that vehicle is mechanically set up the way it should be. But there's another part to this, right? It's how do we document that we're doing the inspection that we should be doing? And how do we document that we are satisfied that this vehicle's in safe operating conditions? So Kenny, I'm going to turn that over to you and let you kind of discuss the requirements of Part 396 and those driver vehicle inspection reports.
Yeah, and Mike, I'm going to do that. Before I do, I want to clarify or add on to something you just said. You know, part of the documentation, these inspections are documented 2 ways. One, they're documented by forms that have to be completed, and I'm going to talk about one of those in just a second. But also, the drivers have to document their time. And you know, a couple of podcasts ago, we covered hours of service, and there's some real confusion. And part of our podcast purpose this time is to untangle confusion, particularly tied to pre-trip, post-trip, and DVIRs. But part of that confusion is when a driver logs that time in their hours of service, a lot of drivers equate that to doing the pre-trip inspection, and they're 2 totally separate things. The pre-trip inspection, guys, is physically walking around the truck. That's getting out and checking your truck. It's looking at the lights. It's looking at the tires. It's putting hands on lug nuts and making sure they're tight. It's physically checking out your vehicle. And like Jim said, you got to be satisfied before you drive. That's the pre-trip part of it. And then you get on your ELD, or if you're still allowed to run paper log, you show that time as on duty, not driving, doing a pre-trip inspection. So a lot of drivers get confused. They think, well, if I show it in the hours of service in my ELD, that is the pre-trip. But the pre-trip is actually the inspection itself. So I want our listeners to think about a typical day with a truck driver. And let's pretend the driver is operating during daylight hours, just for the sake of this discussion. So he or she gets up in the morning, whether they're at the terminal or waking up in the sleeper, and before they start their run that day, they do what Jim just described. They do a pre-trip inspection, and they check all of that equipment that Jim just read us out of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. And if they're satisfied that the truck's in good shape, then they go and they work throughout the day. They do their day, okay? So imagine now it's the end of the day, and it's that same driver. He or she's been on the road all day. They've made drops. They're tired. They're hungry. They're ready to get a shower and go to bed. But the regs say at the end of your shift, you got to check that truck again. And that is called the post-trip inspection. And that reg is found in 396.11, and it tells us what the drivers have to check. And it says at a minimum, they will check the following things. They'll check their brakes. They'll check the steering mechanism. They'll check their lights, their reflectors, their tires, their horn, their windshield wipers, rear view mirrors, coupling devices. And FMCSA uses that term coupling devices, but truck drivers need to know we're talking about around the fifth wheel on a tractor, or if you're pulling doubles, the pintle hook on the pup at the back. But we're talking about, and what inspectors look for, particularly on the fifth wheel, is primarily where the fifth wheel assembly is attached to the tractor. Check and make sure all of those bolts are tight. Mike, you and I both have inspected trucks where we would walk along at the drive axle of the tractor, and we physically would reach in with our hand and see if we could turn any of those bolts that the fifth wheel assembly is mounted to the frame of the tractor. That's what it's talking about when it's talking about checking your coupling devices. Wheels and rims, one of the biggest areas where motor carriers are getting popped on roadside inspections. Everything from cracks in wheels, loose lug nuts, missing lug nuts, wheel seals that are leaking, any kind of problems with the wheels and rim. And then the emergency equipment, and Jim went pretty deep into the emergency equipment, but our listeners, our drivers know it's basically three things. You got to have a fire extinguisher. It's got to be charged. It's got to be properly mounted. You got to have your triangles. Now, there's some alternative things you can do for emergency equipment. Years ago, I used to every once in a while come across, particularly some flatbedders. I don't know why flatbedders did it, but we're using fusees. But now I don't ever see anybody choosing anything other than the three triangles. But make sure they're in the box. Make sure they hadn't been run over. They still work right. And then the last one, if your tractor's equipped with fuses, you got to have spare fuses for the tractor. And those are the three things that they check on emergency equipment. So those items have to be checked at the end of the trip. That's why it's called a post-trip inspection. But there's one huge difference between the post-trip and the pre-trip. The pre-trip, there's no written documentation that has to take place. The post-trip, when those items are checked, and again, remember, those are simply a minimum. You should check everything on that truck, but the law says you must check these things, those things I just listed. And if you find anything wrong with any of those items, at that point, you are required by the regulations to complete what is called a DVIR, Driver Vehicle Inspection Report. In the industry, we commonly call it a post-trip inspection report. And that is where you actually note the violations or the things that you have found wrong with the items when you did your post-trip inspection. Now, in a perfect world, here is how this is supposed to work. The driver completes his or her shift. They do their post-trip inspection where they physically inspect the truck. And let's pretend they find out, oh, I've got a brake light out on the trailer. I've got a flat on the drive axle on the tractor. And I had to stop and help a little old lady whose car was on fire. And now my fire extinguisher is discharged. So on their post-trip inspection report, they would write on that that brake lights out on the trailer, have a flat on the tractor on the drive axle, axle number 3, left outside, and my fire extinguisher is discharged. At that point, when the driver completes that DVIR and then follows whatever their company policy is of getting that into the company system, the driver has satisfied their part of completing the DVIR. Okay. Now the motor carrier has responsibility, picks up then, because in a perfect world, let's say that driver pulls into their own terminal and the terminal has a shop and they have mechanics that work overnight. That driver is through. He or she goes and eats supper. They go home, take a bath, they go to bed, and they're sleeping on their 10-hour break. The mechanic gets that DVIR, driver vehicle inspection report, and says, whoa, we got a trailer, it's got a brake light out. We got a tractor, it's got a flat, and he's got a discharged fire extinguisher. The mechanic fixes those 3 things. The mechanic fixes the brake light. The mechanic repairs the tire, and the mechanic puts a new charged fire extinguisher into the tractor, and the mechanic signs that DVIR that says, I fixed these things, and leaves that accessible to the driver, who then comes to work the next morning and does what Jim said and does the pre-trip inspection and checks and says, oh, here's the DVIR from the day before, and look, the mechanic repaired my brake light, they fixed my flat, and I have a brand new charged fire extinguisher in the bracket. The driver then signs verifying that those things have been fixed, and then the motor carrier, the trucking company, has to retain that for a period of 3 months. And Mike, the reason I bring up that record retention, you and I both have done compliance reviews. We've done audits. You've done them for the state of Missouri, and I did them as a trooper for the state of Texas. And one of the easiest things that you find when you do an audit is whether or not motor carriers are actually properly completing this process. And what I would always do as an auditor, because they're required to keep roadside inspection reports for up to a year, I would find roadside inspection reports that had violations on them that could not have occurred instantaneously. The classic one's a slick tire. Somebody pulls into the scales in Oklahoma, and Jim, one of your Oklahoma State troopers, inspects that truck and finds it's got a tread depth problem on the tire. It's got a slick tire, if you will, and they write that up, okay? So an auditor then knows that tire didn't go slick that morning. If it happened today, if it was slick today on an inspection, that tire was slick yesterday. So they will ask for the auditor will ask for the DVIR, the driver vehicle inspection report, from the previous day of the inspection to see if the driver actually listed that tire on there. And that's how trucking companies get in trouble. And I know, Mike, you're going to talk in a few minutes about some of the ramifications of that coming out of the audit process. But it actually ends up being a critical violation on an audit for a motor carrier not to be properly compelling their drivers to complete these DVIRs. Now, I want to add 2 things, and Mike, and I'm going to turn it over to you. We saw a change in this law. It's probably been 10, 12 years ago. I don't know exactly how long, but definitely within our careers, used to completing the DVIR, the driver vehicle inspection report, or what drivers commonly call the post-trip inspection report, was mandatory for every driver every day. You just had to do one, okay? FMCSA came back and gave a little relief to the industry several years ago and said, well, you only have to do one if you find something wrong. If you don't find anything wrong, you don't actually have to complete the form itself. Now, motor carrier can still have a company policy that says we're going to do them every single day. That'd be a motor carrier policy. But FMCSA did us, in my opinion, kind of an injustice, because now we have this split system, and a lot of drivers are confused and says we don't have to do the report anymore. That's not true. If you find something wrong with the truck or the trailer. The other issue that has caused us a real problem is when we got ELDs, the ELD manufacturers all said, well, we can put some premium services on this ELD because it's really nothing more than a computer, and we can add some other features to it. And one of them is we'll do this electronic DVIR, this post-trip inspection report. And so it allows drivers to open up that ELD, go to the inspection section of the ELD, and they simply can check a box now that says, no violations found. The problem is we know that in certain circumstances, drivers are not properly doing the post-trip inspection report. They're simply checking that box. And in other circumstances, even where the driver is properly completing the DVIR, the process of getting that into the hands of the motor carrier, getting the repair completed, getting a mechanic to sign that, and then getting the driver to sign the new one the next morning, that process is being lost. And you would almost think, well, this is a technology improvement. It should be better. This actually hurt us in the industry over using the old paper. Mike, we always had the triplicate. We had that little book that had a white, a pink, and a yellow, and it was carbonless. And the driver would fill it out, and he would, he'd tear off a couple of them and leave the pink one in the book, and then the original and the yellow one would route through the system. And we actually had a way to chase the paper trail. We've lost that now with the ELDs, and in my opinion, it tends to hurt us. And the last thing, Mike, and I'm going to yield to you. Jim mentioned this about intermodal equipment. There's an entire section in the regs about what intermodal equipment needs to do in terms of DVIR. So if you're one of our container haulers, and I've got a ton of them out of Houston that work out of the port, just know you've got your own set of regs there. And part of the reason for that is so many of the motor carriers that are pulling containers are getting chassis out of the chassis pool. They don't actually own them, and they don't really have much control, and they pull a different one every single day. And we've got a real problem in the intermodal industry of folks not properly taking care of those chassis. I know from being a trooper, some of the junkiest equipment I ever stopped were these chassis. You'd have a beautiful tractor pulling it down the road, and the chassis itself would just be a piece of junk. And it was primarily because nobody was really responsible for taking care of those things. So if you pull intermodal containers, just know you've got an entire set of regs, both on the pre-trip and the post-trip, that you got to follow. Now, Mike, one of our purposes of this specific podcast was to clear up some of the confusion about the differences between a pre-trip, a post-trip inspection, the use of the DVIR, and to make it even more confusing. If you look into the regs in Part 396.11 out of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, there's tons and tons of interpretations where DOT has basically come back and said, okay, well, here's the rules, and now here's what we think about those rules. And we know those interpretations actually become part of the reg through an administrative process. So I'm going to punt to you and let you continue to untangle this confusion as we talk about some of the interpretations that are specifically tied to this inspection process and the completion of the DVIR.
Yeah, absolutely. Kenny, you're right. I mean, if our listeners think nobody's ever had a question about 396 that wasn't really clear in the regulations themselves, if you go look at those interpretations that Kenny's talking about, there's 26 of those things. So the industry has reached out and said, hey, we're not clear on this. Can you help us out a little bit? We're going to ask this question and we want some guidance on this. So there's a bunch of those. I want to go through a couple of those. I'm not going to go through them all. I know we've got to respect everybody's time, but I want to go through some of these and just highlight a few that I think are going to be important for our listeners to hear. And I'm going to start with really the first 5. I want to go through those. And I don't know, Kenny, I'm just going to lay a bit. If I was a betting man, which I'm not, but I would just about bet. I'm an old school. I've got my reg book right here in my hand. I bet, Kenny, you've got a reg book within 10 feet of you right now, don't you?
Absolutely.
And Jim, I know you're the same way. We've got our reg books. That's what we like. I'm old school. You can find these online, but I like to have a book. I get it updated at least every year, because I want to have a current copy. That's where the easiest way for me to find these interpretations to go through. So I'm going to go through, we're going to start with number 1 on these interpretations. It says, does 396.11 require the DVIR to be turned in each day by a driver dispatched on a trip of more than 1 day's duration? And basically the guidance says the driver's got to complete that report every day. They have to do the inspections. They have to complete their report, but they can return those to their home terminal upon the completion of their trip. But it does not relieve the motor carrier from fixing anything that they may find on it. Or if the driver notes anything on the DVIR, the motor carrier still got to fix any of those issues if they're safety related, and it affects the safety of that truck. So that's the first thing. Is on a multiple day trip, the reports the reports can be submitted to the motor carrier upon their return to the home terminal. That's interpretation number one. The second one, it says, does 396.11 require that a power unit and a trailer be inspected? So we've got a combination unit. We've got a truck, tractor, and semi-trailer, regardless of what type of trailer it is. And the guidance is absolutely yes. We're not just inspecting the power units. We also have to make sure that that trailer is in safe operating condition. The driver's got to be satisfied the trailer's safe, just like the truck is safe. Question 3, may more than one power unit be included on a DVIR if 2 or more power units were used by a driver during a day's work? Guidance on this one is absolutely not. Every power unit is going to have its own driver vehicle inspection report. So if you've got a driver that has 5 different trucks they drove that day, they're going to have 5 different separate DVIRs for each one of those trucks. All right, which one am I on here? Number 4, does 396.11 require a motor carrier to use a specific type of DVR? And Kenny talked a little bit about this, about the old paper copies we used to see all the time. Now there's electronic versions in the ELDs. But this interpretation, when it came out, it was probably more looking at, if I've got a paper form that I'm using, do they all have to look alike? Is there a specific way they've got to look? And the guidance on this is a motor carrier can use any type of DVR as long as the report contains the information that's required in 396.11 and it contains the signatures that are required for the certification for the driver, for the mechanic, the driver, certifying that the repair has been made. So as long as it meets the requirements of 396.11, it doesn't matter really what the form looks like, as long as it's got that information in it and it's got the places for the signatures in there as well.
You know, Mike, we used to see companies had just the standalone DVIR book that had those carbonless, and then we saw some, it was built onto the log book, you know, either on the back or at the bottom of the log.
Or some would just have a book all itself, like you talked about, those, you know, with the carbon copies in the back there. But things have changed, times have changed. But in the end, what the form actually looks like doesn't matter. It's the required information. That's what we're concerned about there, and definitely the signatures. So I'm going to move on down. I want to hit on question number 10. And this may be one that you think, well, why are we reading this one? It seems kind of specific, but there's a reason why I'm going to read this one, and I'll get to it in just a second. Question 10 says, what responsibility does a vehicle leasing company engaged in the daily rental of commercial motor vehicles have regarding the placement of the DVR in the power unit? And this is the guidance from the FMCSA, and this is the point I'm trying to make. It says a leasing company has no responsibility to comply with 396.11 unless it is the carrier. It is the responsibility of the motor carrier to comply with Part 396, regardless of whether the vehicles are owned or leased. That's the point right there. The carrier is responsible for compliance with Part 396 and these DVIRs. Not if you're leasing vehicles, regardless of where they're coming from, and you're the motor carrier, you're the one that is responsible for everything that we've talked about today. I'm going to jump down to question 19, excuse me. Who is responsible for retaining DVIRs for leased vehicles, including those of owner operators? Okay, so this is in the same theme as that last question. And the guidance says the motor carrier is responsible for retaining the original copy of the DVR and the certification repairs for at least 3 months from the date the report was prepared. Now, the key word there, in my mind, on the guidance is the motor carrier. So if you're leasing on owner operators, which I know a ton of people that do, and Kenny, I know you do too, we've got half our fleets owner operators are leased on. The motor carrier is required, and they're responsible for maintaining the DVIRs, the driver vehicle inspection reports, and that 90-day window or that 3-month window that Kenny talked about earlier is noted in this guidance that they're talking about here. So just because you've got an owner operator that owns his own truck and they're leased onto you, that doesn't relieve you as the motor carrier of the responsibility of retaining those driver vehicle inspection reports. Last one I'm going to take a look at here is question 21. Is the DVR required by a motor carrier operating only one truck, tractor, trailer combination? Now, I know that there are a lot of single unit owner operators out there. One of the exemptions that the regs give in this guidance right here is if you are a single unit owner operator, you've got one tractor and you've got one trailer, you're exempt from the requirement of the DVIR. However, if you've got multiple trailers and they can't be used in a combination together, so you've got 2 53-foot dry van trailers and one tractor, you lose that exemption. So just remember, it's one truck, one trailer, there's an exemption from the DVIR. Otherwise, everybody's got to fill this out, even if you're a single unit owner operator and you've got multiple trailers. So there's a ton of information there. Those interps I just went through, that's not even half of what's in there in Part 396.11 as far as the extra guidance that the FMCSA has provided our industry. So I'm going to say, I know we say this often through our podcast and typically towards the end, but I'm going to say it right now, and I'll probably say it again later. If you have additional questions about these reports, DVIRs, and what's required, please reach out to your risk consultant, and we can help you kind of wade through some of this stuff and get the answers to the questions you may have. And don't ever be embarrassed about having questions, because as you can see from the guidance we've got from the interpretations, industry's had a lot of questions on this topic. So you're not the only one that would have a question if you do have one. So feel free to reach out to your risk consultant. We're definitely here to help. Now let's jump over to the interpretations in 396.13. There's only a couple there, so we'll take a look at both of them. In 396.13, question 1 says, if a DVIR does not indicate that certain defects have been repaired and the motor carrier has not certified in writing that such repairs were considered unnecessary, may the driver refuse to operate the motor vehicle? And the guidance is, not only should you refuse, the driver is actually prohibited from operating the motor vehicle if the motor carrier fails on that certification, fails to make that certification. The operation of the vehicle, and this is a key point that I'm going to come back around to here in just a minute when we start talking about some of the outcomes of non-compliance with these regulations, but it says the operation of the vehicle by the driver would cause not only the driver to be in violation, but also the motor carrier to be in violation, and both would be subject to the appropriate penalties. And then there's a last section on that answer or that guidance there that says, however, a driver may sign the certification repairs as an agent of the motor carrier if he or she satisfied the repairs have been performed. But the thing I want to point out there is if the certifications have not been made, the certification was not made that the repairs were made, that driver absolutely should not drive that vehicle until it's certified that the repairs were made, because you're putting yourself and your motor carrier in violation. The second question there says, at the end of the day's work and upon completion of the required DVR, what does the driver do with a copy of the previous DVR carried on the power unit? And the guidance says there's no requirement that the driver submit the copy of that previous DVR to the motor carrier, nor is there a retention requirement for the motor carrier. So it's the original with the certification on it. That's what they're looking for. So a lot of information there. Again, we didn't cover all the interpretations in 396.11 at all for sure, but there's a ton of information there. You can go take a look. And again, feel free to reach out. And just like the interpretation, that first interpretation I read in 396.13, if you're not following these regulations as the FMCSA has laid out, you can be subject to penalties. You can be placed in violation, and you're subject to the penalties. It's very, very important for our listeners to understand that non-compliance with these regulations can have a significant impact on your safety rating if you're being audited by the FMCSA. If we look in 385, and Kenny referenced this earlier, if we look in Part 385, Appendix B, this is where we're going to find the explanation of the safety rating process for an audit. You're going to find a list of critical and acute violations in there. And there's a couple of familiar regulations that we've covered today that are on that list. And the first one, which Kenny mentioned, 396.11A, failing to require a driver to prepare a driver vehicle inspection report. If you're going through an audit and there is a pattern of these violations, it's going to be a critical violation, and you're going to be subject to penalties from the FMCSA if you're found a critical violation on one of these audits. The next one is 396.11A3, and that's failing to correct an out-of-service defect listed by a driver on the driver vehicle inspection report before the vehicle is operated again. And this is an acute violation, so it's even more serious. It doesn't have to be a pattern of violations. It's just one violation. And again, it's going to significantly negatively affect your safety rating if you're going through an audit. So just remember, the goal is to have a motor vehicle that is in safe operating condition. So if you're driving a vehicle that's not mechanically sound and it's not in safe operating condition, you're much more likely to be involved in a motor vehicle accident. So let's continually shoot for these three things: no accidents, no injuries, no fatalities, right? Everybody gets home safe at night. That's the goal. Now, if you need any additional information on anything we covered today, because we have covered a ton, when we start talking about regulations, there's a lot of information here. So if you've got any additional questions on pre-trips, the post-trips, DVIRs, anything else that we covered today, please reach out to your risk consultant. We're here to help, as always. And Kenny, I'm going to open it up to you. Is there any parting thoughts, any words of wisdom as we're starting to wrap up this episode that you want to share with our listeners, or that you want to remind them?
You know, Mike, every time we do a podcast, I try to think what are the really nuggets or the gems that are in that podcast that we want our listeners to go. I mean, we want folks to listen to the entire thing and hope that they enjoy it and learn from it. But you said something so profound, and you said it multiple times, and that is the emphasis on the motor carrier. These trucking companies need to understand that if they're not requiring their drivers to complete DVIRs, and they're not maintaining those DVIRs, that can be very serious consequences for motor carrier, particularly through an audit. Because when you mention those critical and acute violations, you think about it, a company literally could have their safety rating go from a satisfactory to a conditional, or a conditional to an unsat, simply by failing to comply with this one little regulation of doing a DVIR. And so the fact that you stress that it's on the motor carrier, it's on the trucking company, because I've had so many trucking companies say, well, my drivers aren't doing post-trip inspection reports. And I'm sitting there saying, Mr. Owner of trucking company, that's your responsibility. You're the one going to be held responsible in an audit. So, Mike, I'm just tickled to death that you stressed how many of these regs are actually directed at the motor carrier and not just the driver.
Absolutely. Jim, any parting thoughts for our listeners?
A thought that comes to mind after listening to you and Kenny, your detailed explanations of the regs is this: complexity is the enemy of execution. I'm a KISS method guy. Some of these regulations can absolutely seem complex and confusing. So I encourage those listeners to choose the applicable regulations and dissect them down to their operations specific criteria. And Mike, you've hit it many, many times. Do not shy away from seeking that outside consultation.
Absolutely. That's what we're here for. We're here to help. Guys, I appreciate it. I've enjoyed our time today, just talking about this topic. Now, next time we get together, we're going to have an extremely important topic to discuss, and that is the best practices for combating distracted driving. Now, this is something that's extremely prevalent in today's society and something that affects every driver that's out there on the road. So if you want to learn more about this topic, please tune in with us next time. Until then, for my co-host Jim Seibert and Kenny Ray, I'm Mike Bohan. Stay safe, and thank you for joining us on Driving the Line, the trucking podcast that is always in the pursuit of safety.
That's all the time we have for this episode of Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety. We hope you enjoyed our discussion, and thank you for listening. You can rate, review, and subscribe to Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or any other app you're using. You can also follow Marsh McLennan Agency on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks again for listening. Drive safely, everyone.